Life has been full of tough times with a few lucky moments. Losing my parents when I was young hurt a lot, like a pain that never goes away. But I got lucky when the elderly couple next door, the Parkers, took me in. They were the kindest people you could imagine, treating me like their own granddaughter instead of someone they were helping out. We didn't have much money, but we had a lot of love, and that's what mattered. When I turned 18 and was thinking about college, the Parkers died in a car accident. Suddenly, I was alone again. They left me some money for school in their old house in the suburbs. It was a cozy place with lots of memories, but it felt too sad to stay there. So I sold it and bought a small apartment in the city near the college where I enrolled to study financial management. Having a plan and moving forward felt good. Classes were tough but interesting, and I focused on learning everything about numbers and markets. After college, I got a decent job. My days were busy with work, and I was doing okay, but the nights were different. The city felt lonelier than it should for a place with so many people. That's when I met Tom at a friend's party. He was loud, funny, and didn't care who noticed. His energy was contagious, and we clicked right away when he accidentally bumped into me, spilling my drink. "Hey, watch it," I said, more surprised than angry. "My bad. Let me make it up to you. What were you drinking?" Tom said with a big grin. "Beer, just beer," I replied, trying not to smile too much. "2 beers, coming right up," he shouted over the music as he headed to the bar. That was Tom, simple, straightforward, and no fuss. We spent the whole night talking about everything and nothing. We found out we both loved old movies and hated sushi. Talking to him was easy, and when the party ended, I didn't want to say goodbye. A year later, he proposed. There were no dramatic gestures, just him, me, and a ring he awkwardly pulled out of his pocket while we were watching TV. "Marry me," he said, holding the ring so tightly I thought he might crush it. I laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was so typical of us. Perfectly imperfect. "Yes, of course, you big goof." Getting married didn't change much at first. We were the same, just officially a couple, which felt right. We settled into life together in my small city apartment, still close to the hustle, but now with someone to share the quiet moments. Life felt full, and for the first time in a long while, the evenings didn't feel so empty. Settling into married life had its comforts, but life has a way of throwing curveballs. Tom's parents, Mr. and Mrs. Dawson, were wonderful. They lived in a cozy suburban home and welcomed me with open arms from the start. I could see where Tom got his easygoing nature. Their warmth was a balm for my heart, which still ached from losing my own family. "I'm so happy you're part of our family now," Mrs. Dawson would often say, squeezing my hand with such kindness that it warmed and overwhelmed me at the same time. "Thank you. I really appreciate how welcoming you've been," I replied, feeling genuinely grateful. Visiting them became our weekend tradition. Those days were filled with backyard barbecues and long conversations over cups of hot coffee. Life felt good, simple, and sincere. But then things changed. Tom was called away on a long business trip, a whole year out of state. It was a great opportunity for his career, but the timing couldn't have been worse. Just as he left, Mr. and Mrs. Dawson's health declined rapidly. It happened so quickly that Mrs. Dawson, bless her heart, sounded frantic with worry when she called. "Grace, I hate to ask, but I really need your help here. Mr. Dawson is not doing well," her voice thick with tears she was trying to hold back. Without a moment's hesitation, I packed a bag and went to the suburbs. Seeing Mr. and Mrs. Dawson so frail shook me deeply. He had always been a pillar of strength and now looked fragile, connected to life through a tangle of medical equipment. I seamlessly settled into their routine, taking care of cooking and cleaning while Mrs. Dawson focused on Mr. Dawson's care. In the evenings, I sat by their side, reading aloud his favorite books, often finding him asleep before I finished a chapter. "Thank you, Grace," he'd whisper on the good days, his voice a mere whisper of its former strength. "It's my pleasure, really," I'd reply, squeezing his hand gently, hoping to offer comfort through my touch. One quiet afternoon, as I was chopping vegetables for dinner, Mrs. Dawson sat down at the kitchen table looking older than her years. "Grace, I don't know how to say this, but we're in a bit of a bind," she began, nervously twisting her hands together. "Mr. Dawson was the main earner, you know, and with him like this?" I set down the knife, giving her my full attention. "We're in a tight spot, honey. I hate to ask, but could you consider renting out your apartment? It might help us get through this rough patch," Mrs. Dawson said, looking down with clear embarrassment. I didn't hesitate for a moment. "Of course, Mrs. Dawson. I'll take care of it right away," I said firmly, wanting to ease her worries. The apartment rented out quickly, and every month I faithfully sent the rental income to Mrs. Dawson, along with money for groceries and bills. It wasn't easy. The commute to my city job became a daily struggle. But family sticks together, right? That's what I kept reminding myself, even on the toughest days. "You're a lifesaver, Grace," Mrs. Dawson would often say, her relief palpable each time I handed over the money. "It's what family does. I'd reply, though some nights, lying in the guest room and hearing distant sirens from the city, I couldn't help but feel the weight of my responsibilities. Harry's calls were my only relief, his voice a connection to another world. "How are things going, Grace? Are you managing okay?" His concern was always clear, even through the static of our long-distance calls. "We're managing. Don't worry about us," I would say, forcing cheerfulness into my voice to ease his concerns. Life at the Dawsons took a sharp turn when Emily, Mrs. Dawson's daughter from her first marriage, unexpectedly showed up. The atmosphere changed instantly. She had a presence that felt like a cold draft sneaking under the door. I didn't know Emily well, but I'd heard enough from Harry and seen her tense visits with Mr. and Mrs. Dawson. My days were already stretched thin with long commutes and caring for Mr. Dawson, who was now bedridden and declining rapidly. Emily's arrival added a new layer of tension. It was clear she planned to stay, making herself at home as if she owned the place. One evening, after a particularly tough day, Mr. Dawson motioned for me to come closer, his voice a strained whisper. "Grace, you need to watch out for Emily. She's not a good person," he said, his tone grave and urgent, sending a chill through me. "I understand, Mr. Dawson. I'll be cautious," I promised, though I wasn't entirely sure what I was preparing for. True to Mr. Dawson's warning, Emily wasted no time asserting her authority. The first indication came one morning when I found her in the kitchen, a storm cloud over the breakfast nook. "Just so we're clear, I'm not here to play housemaid or chef for anyone," she declared sharply, sipping her coffee and eyeing me as if I were intruding in her mother's kitchen. I was taken aback but kept my composure. "Okay, Emily, I've been handling things so far, and I can continue," I replied, trying to keep the peace. "Good, because I don't plan on lifting a finger." "This is Mom's house, after all," she snapped back, her eyes challenging me to object. From then on, Emily ensured her presence was felt, but not in a positive way. She ordered takeout only for herself and her mother, leaving their empty boxes for me to clean up. Her disdain was clear and hurtful, but I endured it for Mr. and Mrs. Dawson's sake. "Grace, why don't you join us for dinner tonight?" Mrs. Dawson suggested one evening, a rare moment of warmth in her voice. Before I could respond, Emily interjected sharply. "Mom, Grace has been busy all day. She probably prefers eating later," her words laced with false concern, yet the message was unmistakable. I wasn't wanted. The days grew more difficult, my workload increasing. Emily's entitlement pervaded every corner of the house. At night, I could hear her whispering with her mother, poisoning her against me with her words. Mrs. Dawson, once kind and understanding, began to change, her demeanor colder, her gratitude less frequent. A couple of weeks later, Mr. Dawson passed away. The funeral was somber, with Harry flying in just in time to bid his farewells. It was the first time in months we were together, and having him by my side brought a sense of relief. Yet amidst the grief, I sensed a significant change at the Dawson home. Emily suddenly behaved impeccably, treating everyone with forced politeness. "How have things been while I've been away?" Harry asked quietly during a brief moment alone after the service. "Fine. Everything's been fine," I lied, forcing a smile. I didn't want to burden him further. His own grief was already too much to bear. "Are you sure? You look exhausted," he pressed, concern etching his brow. "It's just been busy, helping out around here," I reassured him, avoiding his gaze. It wasn't the right time to delve into the brewing turmoil beneath the surface. Once Harry departed, Emily dropped her facade. The guise of a caring sister vanished, replaced by the familiar sneer and dismissive attitude. The atmosphere in the house shifted drastically. Perhaps consumed by her own grief, Mrs. Dawson grew distant and cold toward me. Orders replaced conversations, and I began to feel more like an intruder than a member of the family. Emily took control of the household as if she were the lady of the manor, showing little regard for anyone's feelings but her own. She started barging into my room without knocking, rifling through my belongings as though searching for hidden treasure. One afternoon, while seeking solace in the garden, I stumbled upon a box hidden among the shrubs. Curious, I opened it only to discover my watches, jewelry, and even some of my underwear inside. My heart sank. Nearby, I found several of my dresses tossed carelessly over a bush. Anger surged through me. Clutching the box tightly, I stormed back inside, finding Emily lounging in the living room as if she owned the place. "What on earth, Emily?" I demanded, my voice trembling with fury. "You can't just throw my things out like this." Emily laughed coldly, the sound echoing mockingly in the room. "You live here? Please. You're just a guest, and not a welcome one at that. You should be out in the garden or, better yet, on the street. You're nothing but a freeloader anyway." Her words cut deep, like salt in a wound. I couldn't believe the venom in her voice. Shaking, I turned to Mrs. Dawson, who had just entered the room. "Mrs. Dawson, please tell her she can't treat me like this. This is supposed to be my home too," I pleaded, my voice cracking with emotion. Mrs. Dawson, once gentle and kind, now looked through me as if I were transparent. This is Emily's house now. She's right, Grace. Maybe it's time you found somewhere else to live, she said coldly. Her words hit me hard. Standing there with the box in my hands, my heart shattered. The home I had grown to love, the family I believed in, crumbled around me in that moment. Despite everything, I stayed because of a promise I made to Mr. Dawson on his deathbed, to care for his wife and prevent Emily from dominating her. But day by day, Mrs. Dawson seemed to adopt Emily's harsh demeanor. Her words turned cutting, her gaze icy. You're just idling away here, aren't you? Mrs. Dawson snapped one evening as I cleaned up after dinner, her voice dripping with disdain. I'm doing my best to keep things in order, I replied, trying to stay composed despite the pain her words caused. Your best? I could hardly tell. It seems like you're just mooching off us, she scoffed, turning away without another word. Her words wounded me deeply. I was far from a freeloader. I had rented out my apartment and faithfully handed over almost all the income to Mrs. Dawson. On top of that, I took care of most household tasks while Emily contributed nothing but criticism. Emily, living off her mother's pension, showed no gratitude. Really, what does my brother even see in you? Emily taunted nightly, her voice carrying through the thin walls. Each time I bit back my anger and frustration, clinging to the promise I made. But the house grew suffocating, filled with hostility like a minefield. One evening, returning early from work, my world turned upside down. I walked in on Emily and Mrs. Dawson in a heated discussion in the living room, unaware of my presence. We need to convince her to sell that apartment of hers. You know how much we could use that money, Emily said greedily and calculatingly. Yes, but how do we persuade her? Grace isn't naive. She won't just hand it over, Mrs. Dawson replied, frustration and greed evident in her voice. Leave it to me, Mom. I'll charm her into it. Once she signs it away, we can finally live the way we deserve. Emily's words cut through the air like a snake's hiss. Hearing them scheme to take away my only financial security was a brutal dose of reality. Fear gripped me. I couldn't stay any longer. Heart pounding, I slipped away to my room unnoticed. They were plotting to strip me of everything. The decision was clear in that moment. There was no way I could stay after hearing their plans. Quickly gathering my essentials, hands trembling, every second in that house felt like a countdown to disaster. I didn't bother with goodbyes. They didn't deserve them. Sneaking out the back door, I called a taxi to take me to the station. Sitting on the train to Harry's, doubts gnawed at me. Would he understand? Would he take their side? The uncertainty weighed heavily, but the fear of staying was more daunting. I stared out the window, the landscape blurring by, a mix of fear and determination settling in my chest. When I arrived at Harry's doorstep, his reaction was a blend of shock, relief, and curiosity. His eyes widened as he opened the door to find me standing there with my bag, looking as frazzled as I felt. Grace, what's going on? Are you okay? He asked, stepping aside to let me in. I hesitated, taking in the familiar and comforting sight of his temporary home. No, Harry, everything's not okay. Not at all, I replied, my voice catching. He guided me to the couch, concern etched on his face. Tell me what happened, babe. I'm here for you, he urged gently. I poured out everything to Harry, starting from Emily's return and the deteriorating situation at home to the financial pressures and the final betrayal. Their scheme to make me sell my apartment. I hadn't wanted to burden him while he was away working. As I spoke, Harry's expression darkened with each detail. By the time I finished, his fists were clenched, his jaw tight with anger. Why didn't you tell me about any of this sooner? He asked, his voice a mix of fury and concern. I didn't want to cause you more stress. I thought I could handle it, I confessed, feeling foolish now. Grace, damn it, you shouldn't have had to handle any of this alone, he exploded, rising to pace the room. I can't believe my mom and Emily would treat you like this. He stopped abruptly and faced me, his eyes blazing with determination. I won't let anyone treat my wife that way. No way, he declared firmly, pulling out his phone. I watched, heart pounding, as Harry dialed his mother. The phone barely rang twice before she answered. I couldn't hear her side of the conversation, but the tension in Harry's posture spoke volumes. Mom, this has to stop. I know everything now, and I won't stand for it. If Emily doesn't leave and if you don't start treating Grace with respect, we won't be able to support you anymore. No more financial help, nothing. Harry's voice was firm, leaving no room for negotiation. There was a terse exchange, followed by silence. Harry's grip tightened around the phone. Fine. If that's your decision, then you've made mine, he said finally, hanging up. He turned to me, his expression softening. Looks like it's just us now, babe. That's all we need, he said, coming over to embrace me. I leaned into him, finding solace in his arms amid the storm of emotions. Just us, I whispered, feeling the truth of his words. Now on our own, it felt right. Harry and I stayed up late into the night, planning our future without the burden of supporting his mother and Emily. We discussed practical matters like my remote work and our financial strategies, laying the groundwork for a new chapter together, just the two of us. Whatever happens, we're in this together. You and me against the world, right? Harry said with a determined smile. Absolutely, I replied, feeling reassured with him beside me. Against the world. The next few days were incredibly busy. I arranged to work from home with my job, which they agreed to. Harry helped me move my things out of storage and set up the home office in his living room corner. It wasn't perfect, but it was ours, and it felt peaceful. A week passed, and just when things seemed calm, I received a startling call that felt like a blast from the past. It was Mrs. Dawson, her voice now a mix of desperation and boldness. Grace, why haven't I received the money for this month? You know we really need it, she demanded straight away. I was speechless for a moment, shocked by her audacity. After everything, you still expect me to keep supporting you? I asked, more amazed than angry. In the background, Emily's voice came through, angry and sharp. She's just ungrateful. Make her send the money. Taking a deep breath to calm myself, I remembered their hurtful words, words that had cut deep. Mrs. Dawson, Emily called me a heartless beggar. I can't send money to people who treat me so badly. I'm done. There was silence on the other end, and I imagined Mrs. Dawson's stunned expression. But we're family, she finally said, her voice a mix of anger and pleading. No, family doesn't treat each other like this. Goodbye, Mrs. Dawson, I said firmly, hanging up before she could reply. The call shook me, but Harry was there, supportive as ever. You did the right thing, Grace. It's time they learned to stand on their own, he said, putting his arm around me for comfort. Not long after we settled back into our hometown, another surprise came our way. I found out I was pregnant. It was unexpected but brought us immense joy, and suddenly, the future looked bright with possibilities. We decided it was time to sell my apartment and buy a small house in the suburbs, close to a good school for our child. As we planned our move, another call came from Mrs. Dawson. This time her tone was different, desperate, and almost pitiful. Grace, I've made a mistake. Emily made me sell the house, took the money, and left me with nothing. Could I come and live with you and Harry? Her voice trembled with pleading. Her request stunned me. After everything that had happened, this was a test of my determination. Mrs. Dawson, you chose this path when you sided with Emily against us. There were other choices you could have made, I replied firmly, though my emotions were in turmoil. I know I've made mistakes, but you have a kind heart. Can't you forgive an old woman for her wrong choices? She pleaded. I sighed deeply, feeling a twinge of sympathy, but also holding firm to the consequences of her choices. I forgave you long ago, but that doesn't mean I can welcome you back into my life. You need to face the outcomes of your actions, just as I have, I said before ending the call and blocking her number. With determination, we moved ahead with our plans, buying a charming house with a small garden where our child could grow and play. On a lazy Sunday morning, as I leisurely flipped through the newspaper over coffee, a headline caught my attention. Local woman arrested for massive fraud scheme. There in the picture was Emily, in handcuffs and looking defeated. I couldn't help but feel a mix of shock and perhaps a small sense of vindication. Harry, look at this, I called out, holding up the newspaper for him to see. It's Emily. She's been arrested for fraud. Harry took the newspaper, his expression serious as he scanned the article. Wow, can't say I'm surprised, but it's a lot to process. Yeah, it is, but she made her decisions, and now she's dealing with the consequences, I replied, feeling a sense of closure I hadn't realized I needed. Over time, we heard through friends that Mrs. Dawson was living in a small apartment, working 2 jobs to make ends meet. Her pension wasn't enough to cover her living expenses and repay the debt Emily had left behind. Have you heard about your mom? Harry's friend, Matt, brought it up one evening during a backyard barbecue. Yeah, I heard, Harry replied, tending to burgers on the grill. His voice held a hint of sadness, but also determination. She chose her path, Matt. It's tough, but that's how it goes. Matt nodded, understanding the unspoken boundaries. You're right, man. Just wanted you to know. After that, the conversation lightened, with talk turning to sports and work as the evening progressed. Life moved forward, and so did we. The joy of our new life became even clearer when Mia arrived. Becoming parents changed everything. It shifted our priorities, our dreams, and even started to heal some old wounds by filling them with new love. Can you believe she's ours? I whispered to Harry one night as we watched Mia sleeping peacefully in her crib. She's perfect, Grace. Absolutely perfect, Harry whispered back, his voice filled with emotion. We cherished each day, celebrating every little milestone Mia reached, each smile, each giggle. She was our little miracle, and with her the difficulties of the past seemed to fade away, making space for new and better memories. Each day was simple yet filled with small moments of joy that created a beautiful tapestry of family life.